10 days had passed since the Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima, and for Chandler Johnson's battle-worn men, this day would prove as costly as any they'd faced in their fight for Mount Suribachi. Picture this: Marines struggling through a nightmare landscape of massive boulders on a steep slope west of Hill 362, right in front of the menacing Nishi Ridge. The terrain wasn't quite as wicked as the volcano they'd conquered, but the enemy's violent resistance was claiming frightful casualties for every single yard they advanced. By the time the sun set on that terrible day, 3 of the men captured in Joe Rosenthal's famous flag-raising photo would be dead. 2 others who had helped raise that first small flag on Suribachi's summit would be cut down with near-fatal wounds. Sergeant Michael Strank, you'd recognize him as the third figure from the left in Rosenthal's iconic picture, was leading Easy Company's push with 4 other Marines when Japanese machine gunners and mortar teams isolated them completely. For 4 agonizing hours, they fought a desperate holding action. Strank was sketching their position in the sand, telling Corporal Joe Rodriguez they needed to send someone back to inform the company of their location, when death came without warning. No one heard the incoming mortar until it exploded. The blast killed Strank instantly, blowing him backward with his arms thrown above his head. Corporal Harlon Block, the Marine on the far right in Rosenthal's photo, died in that same explosion. Like Strank, he never knew he'd become famous as one of the Suribachi flag raisers. Neither did Sergeant Henry Hansen, whose life had once been saved by the incorrigible Private Rule who had died protecting him. Hansen was moving toward the ridge when someone shouted a warning about heavy small arms fire. "You worry too much," Hansen called back as he skirted around a boulder, and in that instant, a machine gun burst cut him down. The casualties kept mounting. Corporal Charles Lindbergh, still carrying his flamethrower, took a bullet through his forearm and chest. Corporal Robert Leader, who would have become a Notre Dame professor, was hit in the stomach by small arms fire. By nightfall, both were aboard the hospital ship Samaritan, their war over. As the sun set, the 5th Division had finally secured the crest of Hill 362A and surrounded its base. The front line stretched 1,000 yards before Nishi Ridge, 300 yards closer than where they'd started that morning. But the cost was staggering. The 28th Regiment suffered its heaviest casualties yet. Fresh replacements would fill the ravaged ranks, but you couldn't replace men like Tony Stein, Aaron Wilkins, Robert Wilson, Harlan Block, Michael Strank, Henry Hansen, and hundreds of others who had fallen since D-Day. Meanwhile, across the island on the 4th Division front, the 24th Regiment made yet another attempt to capture Hill 382 and silence what the Marines grimly called the meat grinder. Paul Treatle's 1st Battalion and Dick Rothwell's 2nd began their push at 8:30 in the morning after 45 minutes of preparatory shelling. But like so many attempts before, the attack stalled almost immediately when the spearhead companies ran into heavy Japanese artillery and mortar fire. It took nearly 3 hours before naval shell fire, carrier planes dropping napalm bombs, and barrages from Marine 155mm howitzers finally quieted the heavy shelling. Even then, fierce resistance erupted from positions on the hill and Turkey Knob. By mid-afternoon, Fox Company had gained a mere 150 yards, while George Company was completely pinned down on the slopes of 382. The Marines had almost no cover from the intense small arms and machine gun fire raining down from the high ground and bypassed caves. Progress came only through brutal close-quarters combat as individuals and small units worked forward, fighting for every yard, every position. Late in the afternoon, part of one company from the 2nd Battalion finally made it up, 382, and started digging in along the western edge of the two-ridge crest. But scarcely 100 yards to the east, Japanese troops manned a strong complex of reinforced positions, their heavy machine guns blazing away at the Marines. When Colonel Rothwell moved up with a reconnaissance patrol to scout Marine positions for the night, they found no man's land transformed into a blazing scene of give-no-quarter action. In a chaotic melee of hand-to-hand combat, Marines struggled to push the tenacious Japanese from the crest, while the enemy desperately tried to drive the attackers from their fragile foothold. At sunset, it was a standoff, but an important piece of Hill 382 now belonged to the Marines. Whether they could hold it through the night was another matter entirely. Colonel Rothwell left Captain Roland Carey's Easy Company with the job of holding the position and scrambled down the rocky slope to plan the next day's attack. Major Treatell's battalion had fought with limited success throughout the day, trying to strengthen lines around the base of the hill and move up Turkey Knob. The opposition was so severe, casualties so heavy, that troops were ordered to pull back to their jump-off point. This triggered even heavier enemy fire: mortars, small arms, mortars, and artillery barrages from north of the meat grinder. Only after laying down a smoke screen could they evacuate the wounded and consolidate their line. The 4th Division's losses for Day 10 totaled 374 dead and wounded. In 11 days, they'd suffered 5,595 casualties, and slightly less than half of Iwo Jima was in American hands. But General Gates found at least one consolation: his Marines were now atop Hill 382, positioned to swarm the rest of it from all directions. He knew General Kuribayashi's defenses in this sector had to crack soon. There was simply no way the Japanese could withstand much more of this constant pounding from the Navy's big guns, the night and day battering from artillery, the bombing and strafing from carrier planes, and the relentless attacks by Marine infantry. General Erskine was still frustrated over the refusal to release the 3rd Regiment for the drive to crush Japanese defences in Iwo's centre and push to the northern coast. He remained confident the 9th and 21st Marines could break through, but he was convinced the job could be done faster, with proportionately fewer casualties, if he had 3,000 more troops. But orders were orders. So at 8 in the morning on Day 11, the 3rd Division attack began again with the men and weapons already on the front. Erskine felt inward pride, though never satisfied, as was his nature, about his division's grinding progress. His men hadn't stormed the beaches on D-Day, but since landing they'd seized Motoyama Airfield No. 2, hammered through Kuribayashi's strongest defences to steamroller through Motoyama village, overrun part of the heavily defended 3rd airstrip, and now stood less than 1,500 yards from splitting Iwo in two by driving to its northern shoreline. 30 minutes of artillery fire preceded the push. Nothing spectacular, but as one sergeant from the 9th Marines put it, it meant the butcher shop was open for another day's business. Nearly 4,000 men joined the double-pronged 5-battalion attack, one thrust aimed due north toward Hill 362B, the other pointed eastward to clear the rest of the 3rd airstrip. Strong opposition flared immediately from enemy positions along the hump-shaped 1,000-yard front. Violent enfilading machine gun and mortar fire erupted from emplacements atop the hill and hidden cave mouths on its slopes where the 21st Regiment pushed the attack. Several Sherman tanks moved out across the flatness of Motoyama No. 3 ahead of the 9th Marines, but hidden concrete bunkers housing 75mm guns and Japanese tanks buried to turret depth stopped them cold. Lieutenant Colonel Lowell English's 2nd Battalion spearheaded the 21st's bogged-down movement. Less than 30 minutes after jump-off, mortar fragments hit him, but he refused evacuation. "Just a nick," he said of the wound, fighting on at the front until shortly before 5:30 in the evening, when more shrapnel ripped into his shoulder. This time they carried him off the line, still giving orders as they placed him on a stretcher. Major George Percy took over the hard-hit outfit. At 47 years old, he was the battalion's executive officer and the oldest battlefield commander in the Marine Corps. Hardly anyone could understand why he was even in the armed forces, much less fighting on Iwo Jima. But Percy had his private reasons. "We have got to win this war. I am going to do my part, and I am going to be a Marine to do it," he'd told family and friends when he enlisted 2 years earlier. Percy had been a successful Wall Street broker, overweight and overage, hardly Marine Corps material, but he'd wangled a commission as a paymaster and talked his way overseas. When he applied for combat duty, flabbergasted superiors turned him down flat, saying he was too old and physically unfit to lead troops in battle, possibly even a little crazy to suggest such an assignment. He used all the salesmanship he had learned in selling stocks and bonds, English recalled, and he got what he wanted. During training, Percy had trudged along with the men in back-breaking field exercises on Guam's steep semi-mountains. It didn't take long for troops to learn he was a born leader, an opinion confirmed when the 21st Regiment launched its push up Iwo Jima's rugged backbone. "The old guy seemed to be everywhere," a bewildered gunnery sergeant said, and especially when the going was roughest. In 9 days of combat, this intrepid major had been wounded twice by mortar fragments. Both wounds were serious enough to warrant evacuation, but he stayed off the front just long enough to have them dressed before returning to the fight. He was still leading the battalion when the island was finally conquered. He would still be going if the outfit had not run out of Japanese, Ray Henry said of the battling broker. Tanks and artillery tried 3 times during the day to spring the attack. Shells screamed over Marines' heads as barrages roared into 362B and defences just beyond the eastern fringe of the airstrip. But when the fire lifted, heavy Japanese resistance flared again, keeping the advance pinned down. At sunset, the line showed little change. The enemy still held part of the airfield, a 300-yard patch of minefields and clusters of machine gun pits, artillery, and anti-tank gun positions. Hill 362B remained a cauldron of defiance. The 5th Division men would later learn why Nishi Ridge was so hard to take, but when Day 11's attack began, they knew only that it remained a Japanese stronghold blocking the push on the Western Front. Its stark 200-foot elevation was formidable by itself, a fortress held by 1,000 of Kuribayashi's best troops. Only after it fell did Marines discover the ridge was probably Iwo's most intricate and strongest fortification. Its steep slope extended almost to the western shoreline, containing nearly 100 camouflaged cave entrances armed with machine guns and mortars. Like other Japanese defences, these were connected by an elaborate tunnel system. One tunnel stretched more than 1,000 feet long, with numerous offshoots burrowing through the ugly escarpment. The network was lit by electricity, and where tunnels merged, 2 shafts led to the flat summit, providing ventilation and quick ways to move troops between positions and supply ammunition to the bunkered artillery on the mesa's crest. Marines were on the summit of bypassed Hill 362A, but its sides remained infested with pockets of resistance that had clear fields of fire on troops attacking the ridge. Behind the ridge lay the flattened rubble of Nishi Village's tiny cluster of 6 adobe buildings. It was a strange battle, even for Iwo. When the attack jumped off, Marines found themselves advancing while answering Japanese fire from 2 directions, ahead toward Nishi Ridge and backward from 362A. 4,500 men joined the push, CMAO, 3 battalions from Chet Graham's 26th Regiment and 2 from Harry Liversedge's 28th Marines. There was the usual pre-attack heavy shelling, 30 minutes of artillery, some naval fire, and airstrikes. As usual, the Japanese were stunned, but not for long. As soon as the Marines moved out, the enemy answered with devastating firepower. Tanks spearheaded Graham's thrust, carving out meagre gains in the rocky ground before the hill. Liversedge's troops, with Chandler Johnson's battalion at the point, advanced through a hail of mortars and small arms fire, NET. It was Suribachi all over again, as each yard of progress claimed more casualties. But yard by yard, gains were made through grinding frontal attack. Jackson Butterfield's battalion fared better. In reserve, mopping up stubborn bypassed positions in the ravines before Nishi Ridge, they still took strong crossfire from the elevation and 362A's caves behind them. 3 heavy machine guns were brought forward to spray the honeycombed face of the ridge, but whenever positions were silenced, more came to life. Sherman tanks made repeated, futile attempts to smother the firestorm, but were bogged down by tank traps and terrain. Progress came only after an armoured bulldozer and a Sherman with a scraping blade carved a narrow path through the obstacles. As they rumbled forward, Japanese sappers darted from bypassed spider traps with sputtering demolition charges, hurling them against the tanks. The charges detonated in roaring blasts but did little damage. 3-inch wooden planks protected the steel hulls, absorbing the impact. Only after a flame-throwing Sherman joined the melee with its tongue of fire was the opposition finally wiped out. Chandler Johnson's battalion faced panic twice during the morning when mortars crashed down and exploded in heavy clouds of green smoke. Acrid fumes hugged the ground and vomiting men were everywhere along the front. But except for heavy nausea and burning, tear-filled eyes, no lasting harm was done. The mystery gas, probably picric acid, soon dissipated, and the fighting continued. Despite everything, the advance punched forward yard by yard, position by position, until the line cracked. In early afternoon, 150 well-disciplined Japanese hit the Marines in a desperate counterattack. The charge was beaten back, and the attack hammered across the last ravine before Nishi Ridge. Captain Dave Severance's Easy Company, TAD, the first outfit atop Suribachi, TADS, scrambled to the base and began digging in. Chandler Johnson wasn't far behind. Throughout the fight, he'd moved with his men as he had on D-Day and in the battle for the volcano, oblivious to enemy fire. wearing his tattered fatigue cap with upturned bill, his Colt pistol wrapped in a handkerchief and jammed in his hip pocket. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a spell of quiet settled on the front as the chunky colonel, grinning like a vacationing tourist, sauntered among the weary men. Some were propped up with backs against boulders, opening sea rations. Others cleaned rifles and checked ammunition, grateful to be alive. One Marine merrily rode a Japanese bicycle, circling around his amazed buddies and ringing a bell on its handlebars like an ice cream vendor in a park. He'd found it in a nearby cave whose steel door had been blasted open half an hour earlier by a bazooka. "Plenty more wheels where this came from," he grinned, "if you guys would like to join the parade." Several men watched a grunting gun crew pulling and pushing a 37mm anti-tank weapon into firing position. One grimy, bleary-eyed corporal, his dungarees tattered and stained with sweat and volcanic ash, chuckled loudly as he saw his jaunty, rambunctious colonel approach a shell hole. He was sure Johnson expected to find Marines there. Instead, there were Japanese dead. In that instant, a shell exploded at Chandler Johnson's feet, and he died there. 1 second he was striding along in all his vigor, the next he was in pieces. Sergeant Richard Wheeler said of the bizarre scene made more tragic by the fact that Johnson was probably killed by friendly fire. Tears were shed without shame by the men. If they talked, it was with heavy lumps in parched throats. "No good war. He is gone," one managed to mutter. "I cannot believe it. The colonel is gone." Years later, whenever aging survivors of the battalion would meet at 5th Division reunions, talk invariably turned to the exploits of Chandler Johnson, the rough-talking, stern but often gentle, always indomitable warrior who had yelled and cursed and led his men across Iwo's strange, fatal beaches. The man who with certainty and pride had sent his platoon to Suribachi's summit to raise the first flag, who had sent the second one up the slopes because someone is going to want that flag, but he is not going to get it. But most of all, these men of Iwo Jima would recall how the colonel died. They still lament his loss. Major Thomas Pierce, the executive officer, took over the stunned outfit, a shadow of its D-Day strength. He wasn't of Johnson's mercurial temperament or flashy flamboyance, but his 3 medals for valor on New Georgia and Bougainville were solid credentials of fearless and knowledgeable leadership under fire. The men knew the new old man knew his stuff, and were reassured he could handle whatever they might face during the rest of the battle. They set the perimeter that night, knowing the struggle for Nishi Ridge wasn't over, but that Hill 362A was behind them and silenced. Chandler, Johnson, and the others cut down in the day's push were part of the 212 troops from the 5th Division who fell that day on Iwo's western front. No one ever knew Japanese losses, but 68 caves were closed, and hundreds of enemy bodies were found among the rocks and ravines when darkness came. Lieutenant Colonel George Roll, the 5th Division's intelligence officer, was especially interested in the body count. "It appears the enemy's losses have become so heavy that he no longer can retrieve his dead and pull them back to caves behind the lines," he wrote in the day's battle journal. The fury of Day 11 saw no let-up in the pressure to shut down the meat grinder on the 4th Division front. But for the first time, General Gates ordered the attack to move in a probing action 90 minutes before the main attack. So at 6:30 in the morning, the 25th Regiment's 1st Battalion jumped off. "Maybe the Japanese forgot to set the alarm clock," a sergeant said as the muffled push began to envelop Turkey Knob. He was wrong. The Japanese weren't duped. For 20 minutes the action appeared to be going well, but instead of surprising the enemy, Fenton Mee's 900 men moved into a fatal ambush. From countless hidden positions on the elevation's slopes and crest, the Japanese unleashed a thunderstorm of rockets and mortars to pin down the advance. Withering machine gun fire and a hail of grenades clobbered startled Marines as they lunged for cover. It was the start of the 5th day of combat in an area little larger than 3 city blocks, dawn to dusk deaths of friend and foe in the ravines before the knob, on its devilish slopes, and around the big concrete blockhouse on the summit. Artillery and air support were impossible, too. Bogged-down Marines and enemy positions were too close to one another. Tanks were morale boosters for the attackers, but couldn't uncork the advance until mid-afternoon. 8 Sherman tanks, engines roaring and treads grinding foot-deep tracks in the volcanic ash, struggled repeatedly to rekindle the push. They took spasmodic, heavy fire from mortars and anti-tank guns, making scant headway until armored bulldozers carved narrow paths through the rubble. Then, paced by 2 flamethrowers, the line was dented around the base of Turkey Knob. More than 1,000 gallons of jellied fuel incinerated enemy emplacements, and the tanks poured more than 200 rounds of 75mm cannon fire into the blockhouse. For a frantic half-hour in late afternoon, patrols trying to close a pincers around the knob from opposite directions were less than 50 yards apart. This time tanks couldn't help. The terrain was impassable, and heavy artillery was making the area a death trap. Riflemen and demolition teams were caught in merciless machine gun fire as the enemy beat back every attempt to close the narrow gap and seal off the malevolent objective. At 4:30 in the afternoon, a pullback was ordered. Turkey Knob still wasn't surrounded, and its top remained in Japanese hands. While the 25th Regiment battered the ring of steel around Turkey Knob, Walt Jordan's 24th again hit Hill 382 in a 3-battalion attack to drive the last Japanese from the tenacious defences on the fortress's eastern ridge. With heavy action already raging 600 yards to the south in the attack on the Knob, naval heavy shelling, artillery, and a 30-plane airstrike ripped enemy positions for nearly 45 minutes before H-hour at 8 o'clock. The western ridge was held by Roland Carey's Easy Company, HE, an exhausted, hard-hit, half-strength outfit that had endured strong machine gun, mortar, and grenade torment through their night-long vigil on the embattled hilltop. Now the Japanese were counter-attacking again across the no-man's land, separating the two ridges. The Marines hadn't a chance of holding against the superior force without help from men and firepower, all but trapped and immobile on the slopes. Second Lieutenant Richard Reich managed to make the summit with part of his platoon after 30 minutes of desperate clawing up the sharp rocks and boulders in a sizzling non-stop firefight. 2 platoons of Walter Ridlon's Fox Company were doing their best to follow. Machine guns and mortars were cutting them to pieces, but a few men lunged over the lip of the hill under a curtain of bullets and a hailstorm of grenades. Carey crawled down a shallow ravine to a shell hole where Reich had taken cover. Ridlon joined them moments later as small arms fire zinged overhead and raised small sand geysers a few feet away. After a 3-minute parley, they agreed their best bet, probably the only way to hold the feeble line, was for Carey to rally the troops stymied on the slopes. Halfway down the hill, in a violent stumbling and sliding descent, a machine gun burst cut him down. A corpsman scrambled to his side within minutes, but it was nearly an hour before it was quiet enough for stretcher-bearers to drag him from the scene. Captain Patrick Donlan became Easy Company's commanding officer, but before most men knew he was their new CO, mortar fire hit Donlan. First Lieutenant Stanley Osborne ignored the continuing barrage to dash to Donlan's side as another mortar dropped in their midst. Osborne was dead in the blast. Donlan's leg was severely injured, and 2 other men were wounded, one mortally. 22-year-old Reich now commanded Easy Company, Heamdo. He was the only officer left. Most of Fox Company still hugged the incline, pinned down in the frenetic fight for survival. The Japanese are doing their goddamned best to make this the worst day of my life, 25-year-old Ridlon told James Bedingfield, his 20-year-old platoon sergeant, as the men struggled against a concentration of pillboxes blocking their route to the summit. Nothing less than superhuman individual drive finally sprung the Marines from a torn clump of stunted banyan trees and the rubble of boulders just below the crest. Shortly after 3:30 in the afternoon, when the push was 6 hours old, Ridlon sent a message to the battalion command post at the foot of the slope. "Almost to the high ground." For the next half hour the walkie-talkie was silent, then it crackled. "Fox Company on top of Radar Hill." Nearly 200 Marines were now on the summit of 382. But they couldn't claim the violent fortress had been conquered, only that they were atop it with more men and arms, and that, as one said, "You can bet we intend to stay." It was a nervous, noisy night along the thin line on 382's western ridge. First Lieutenant William Cressink, a platoon leader from Fox Company, now commanded Easy Company, MIA, its 5th commanding officer in 10 hours. He was certain the men would hold. "We have not exactly got it made," he told Thomas Kotick, his inherited platoon sergeant, "but after the hell on the hill, we can take anything the Japanese can throw at us." The scene was again nightmarish as parachute flares lit up the violent front and cast eerie shadows from the toppled, twisted girders of the radar tower. Tracer bullets laced the skyline as enemy machine guns clattered spasmodically and were answered by Marine bursts. Artillery, mortars, and grenades fell throughout the night on both sides of the lines. At times, Marines could hear the muffled sounds of Japanese moving through the maze of tunnels under the fortress to reinforce and resupply positions for the next inevitable attack. And so it went for the 10 hours of darkness. Kuribayashi and his staff were busy during the night moving the general's headquarters from its deep concrete blockhouse east of the 3rd airstrip to a vast cave near Kitano Point, where he would make his last stand. Marine stretcher-bearers and jeep ambulances carried the last of the day's 610 4th Division casualties from the front, 207 to the cemetery in the shadow of Mount Suribachi. General Schmidt ordered a change in the battle plan on Day 12. He directed the 5th Division to relieve 3rd Division troops in the attack on Hill 362B. It wasn't that the 5th Corps commander was upset with the 3rd's progress. Rather, he wanted General Erskine's firepower for a steamroller offensive to drive to Iwo's northern shore. This would split the island in the central highlands once and for all, cutting off Kuribayashi's remaining forces from each other, CP1 isolated on the western front, the other on the eastern. Flying in crisscross patterns from 500 to 1,000 feet over the front, Marine spotters in Maytag Messerschmitts watched the attack come to life in brilliant, chilly sunlight. Theirs was a familiar spectacle on Iwo, but totally foreign to anything else in military history. Below them was a battlefield where one army fought above ground and the other fought almost totally beneath it, where thousands of troops moved in the same area at the same time. Marines maneuvering on the surface in the attack, the Japanese moving in tunnels from one underground strongpoint to another whenever the tide of combat called for more firepower or reinforcements. Clearly visible were battalions of Marines crouching in foxholes, waiting for the signal to attack. When it came, they could be seen moving out in small units, fire teams and squads darting forward from cover to cover, from shell hole to shell hole, from boulder to boulder, as increasingly heavy barrages of Japanese artillery and mortars landed among them. Everything beyond the line was completely barren and devoid of any sign of enemy troops, a rugged, uninhabited landscape as mysterious as a solar planet. There were 30 minutes of pre-attack naval and artillery shelling, just enough to wake up the Japanese and let them know we were coming again, a sergeant said with undisguised sarcasm as the push began, pointed toward yet another forbidding hill, some 500 yards east of 362B, an ugly elevation carried on the sector map as Hill 375. It was the last high ground astride the 3rd Division route to the north coast and, according to intelligence reports based on a captured map, bristled with at least 1,000 troops waiting in yet another maze of fortifications and tunnels. Colonel Wither's 21st Regiment learned within minutes that intelligence was correct. With 2 battalions, George Flood's 1st and George Percy's 2nd, in the attack, it became what the ex-stockbroker called a gigantic backfence catfight. Only the cats were snarling and deadly tigers. From dawn to dusk, the Marines battled in the vicious complex of caves, bunkers, pillboxes, and dug-in tanks concealed in a chaotic jumble of torn rocks before and on the precipitous hill. To make matters stickier, Percy's men were taking heavy machine gun and small arms fire from Hill 362B in the adjacent 5th Division sector. But enemy artillery and mortar shelling weren't as fierce as in the past, probably. Intelligence officers speculated Kuribayashi was hoarding precious, rapidly diminishing ammunition for a massive last-ditch counterattack. Tanks, when they could churn through the rocky defiles, knocked out some strong points in the early going but were unable to break through to spark the advance. So, in Iwo's constant pattern, it was another infantry slugging match every yard of the way, as enemy positions were overrun in costly head-on attack. By 11 o'clock, after 4 hours of close-in combat, Percy's determined skirmishers had hacked out 400 yards to the base of Hill 357. By noon, a patrol clawed to the crest, a signal for a screaming surge up the slope by the rest of the battalion. The hill was captured. Although deadly battle was still in progress, the official combat report said, it now appeared that no important enemy resistance remained to block the 3rd Division's path to the sea. Like most projections of Japanese staying power on Iwo, this one missed the mark as still to come bitter fighting and heavy casualties would prove. That night, Kuribayashi's troops mounted a final charge to drive Percy's men from the crest of Hill 357. Shortly after 1:30 in the morning, 200 infiltrators struck in a well-organized raid. It began as a probing action, with self-destructive squads hitting outposts in front of the line, and quickly exploded into a string of full-scale counterattacks. Bleary-eyed but alert, Marines opened fire when they heard muffled sounds of movement and spotted shadowy forms darting among the boulders. Within minutes, the firefight roared with all the firepower the Marines could muster, cutting into the screaming swarm of Japanese. For the next hour and a half, wave after wave of enemy troops were beaten back with bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools in hand-to-hand combat, fought in the glare of star shells and in the stinking sulfur fumes that hugged the ground in nauseating patches. At dawn, Marines counted 163 Japanese bodies. "I must confess, I thought it was a grand sight," Percy said, "but they eliminated or wounded 19 of our people, and I sure did not like that." March 3rd, day 12 after D-Day, was a day of incredible violence and unbelievable heroism for the 5th Division. It became, in General Rocky's words, a legacy of valor. 5 men received the Medal of Honor, and 519 fell in the maelstrom as Marines finally took Nishi Ridge, blasted through the flattened rubble of the village, and hammered 200 yards beyond. Let me tell you about William Harrell, a 22-year-old sergeant from Mercedes, Texas. He was on outpost duty 20 yards in front of the lines before Nishi Ridge with Private First Class Andrew Carter, a 19-year-old lanky Kentuckian from Paducah. They'd shared a foxhole every night since D-Day and were dug in, bone-tired from the day's action and shivering from Iwo's cutting chill. If trouble came from infiltrators, and they expected it would, they'd catch it first. Carter, called the Duke by his buddies, was on watch shortly after midnight when he spotted silhouettes darting among the boulders in the half-light of a parachute flare. He nudged the slumbering Harrell. "They are coming out of the ravine," he whispered, and opened fire as Harrell rolled to his knees. "Got 4 of them," Carter said, still speaking in hushed tones. Harrell fired twice at 2 forms vaulting forward from the shadow of a ravine and saw the figures crumple. The Duke jammed a fresh clip of ammunition into his weapon and squeezed off 3 shots before it jammed. He muttered, "The sand spoils everything." He jumped to his feet. "Be right back. I will get another rifle and more ammo," he said, disappearing into the darkness. Moments later, a hand grenade rolled over the lip of the foxhole and exploded. Harrell's left leg buckled as he tried to get up. He couldn't move his left arm. Falling backward, he felt an unseen body slip into the hole. "Bill, I am back," came the Duke's hushed voice. "What is wrong?" "I am hit. Grenade. Bad, I guess." Harrell was trying to reload his carbine with one hand when 2 Japanese sprang from the ravine. One was swinging a long saber with both hands, and the other was hurling grenades as the Duke triggered his borrowed weapon. It misfired. Split-second instinct took over. He grabbed an enemy rifle, a prized souvenir he'd carried since D-Day, and lunged to his feet to meet the sword-wielding intruder who impaled himself in a screeching yell on the bayonet. He died with the saber still in its violent downswing. It sliced deep into Carter's left knuckles from thumb to little finger. Harrell was now firing his Colt .45. Neither Marine spoke for a few seconds. Carter was wounded and without a weapon. Harrell was certain he was dying. The valiant Texan broke the wordless spell. "Duke, you still alive?" he asked. "Yeah, Sarge. I am alive, but he almost cut off my hand," Carter responded. "What the hell do we do now?" A full-fledged firefight roared around them as the entire line came to life. Machine gun tracers cut amber arches through the night, and the sharp crack of rifles added to the action. Mortars seemed to be falling everywhere, and artillery joined the crescendo. Grenades exploded every few seconds. "Duke, I don't think I will make it," Harrell, the senior man, said. "There is no use in both of us dying here. Get yourself back to the command post and stay there," he ordered. "You are the boss. But I will be back with help." Carter clasped the injured hand to his chest, eased over the lip of the foxhole, and crawled back to the perimeter. Never in his life had Harrell felt so completely alone. He was in awful pain from more wounds than he could count, and he could see in the fading glare of a star shell that his left hand hung like a lifeless claw from tendons at the wrist. He didn't expect Carter to return. The man would be lucky to make it alive back to the lines. But it was lonely as hell, propped up like a stringless puppet, waiting to die. He hoped the enemy would just forget about him. It wasn't to be. He'd hardly had time to think about his fate when a Japanese plummeted into the hole, the 2 men's heads scarcely a yard apart. Another intruder crouched on the rim as his comrade slammed a grenade against his helmet to activate it, dropped the missile at the Marine's feet, and vaulted from the death trap. He'd taken one stride toward the ravine when Harold's pistol cracked and the Japanese dropped with an agonizing scream. The Marine grabbed the hissing grenade and dropped it on the lip of the hole. The blast terminated the other Japanese, obliterated Harold's Colt .45, and injured his right hand. No more Japanese came. As daylight cut through dawn's dull sky, the Duke returned with stretcher-bearers, and they carried the semi-conscious, half-alive sergeant back to the lines for evacuation. The saber of one of the Japanese, the Lakin, later identified as a captain, the Lakin later was beside him on the litter. Marines that morning tallied 12 enemy bodies within yards of the outpost in front of Nishi Ridge, where Harold earned his Medal of Honor. With mechanical hooks for hands, he later returned to Texas A&M College, where he'd studied for 2 years before enlisting, to get his degree and later to run cattle on a ranch with another Texan, Private First Class Louis Bolling, from a tiny town called Donna. Let me tell you about another hero from that day, TR pharmacist's mate 3rd Class Jack Williams, a corpsman with the 28th Regiment's 3rd Battalion. The slight, slow-talking 20-year-old was from Harrison, Arkansas, a sleepy town in the Ozark Mountains in the state's northwest corner, a harsh land of hard-scrabble farming and timber logging. He joined the Navy 2 years earlier with no thought of ending up as a combat medic with the Marines. "I am just a hillbilly who wants to get away from the hills, maybe fight a few Japanese, and see the world," he'd told friends the day he boarded a bus for Little Rock on the first leg of the long trip that ultimately would lead to Iwo Jima. Williams had lost count of how many wounded men he'd treated since D-Day. Sometimes he believed it must have been most of the battalion, a thought not far from fact, since nearly 400 of its original 954 men had been dead or wounded since hitting Green Beach. Now he was at it again with his satchel of bandages, sulfur, plasma and morphine as the Day 12 attack pushed north from Nishi Ridge. Of all of Iwo's terrain, this was the most fiendish in its natural defenses and had been made all but impregnable by man-made fortifications. Upheavals in the island's thin volcanic crust had littered the zone with hundreds of large sandstone boulders surrounded by carpets of loose rock, where the Japanese had dug countless caves with concealed entrances connected by tunnels, extending several hundred yards in all directions, a complex of eroded gorges whose steep sides bristled with machine gun nests and sniper pits covered the area. Fields of fire were usually less than 25 yards, and Marines had little cover from enemy fire, unless they piled loose rocks on the surface. Hill 362B, which had stymied the 3rd Division's attack for 2 days, was now the roadblock to the 5th Division advance. Its slopes and crest still bristled despite the tons of artillery and naval-heavy shelling. The battleground was made to order for Kuribayashi's forces, and they were making the most of it. Since the jump-off at 7:45 in the morning, Williams had braved stifling enemy fire to do what he could to save 14 Marines. 5 others were dead by the time he reached them. The corpsman was crouched in a shallow hole, treating yet another man shortly before noon, when a sniper opened up at short range. 3 bullets hit Williams' abdomen and groin, but he finished bandaging his comrade before trying to address his own belly wounds. Then, ignoring searing pain and fighting to keep from blacking out, Williams patched up another Marine. Sniper fire ricocheted among the rocks of the exposed position as he weighed the odds against survival for himself and the other wounded men. There was only one chance, and it was a long shot. He had to get back to the lines somehow and send out stretcher-bearers. Otherwise, all 3 certainly would bleed to death or die in a storm of sniper bullets. Clasping both arms around his stomach, Williams struggled to his feet and, in an agonizing lurch, headed for help. He'd taken 2 steps when a single rifle shot hit his chest and he fell dead. It was nearly sundown before a patrol reached the scene. Miraculously, the other 2 Marines were still alive. Volcanic ash had helped coagulate their bleeding, and they survived to recount the gallantry and self-sacrifice that brought Williams a posthumous Medal of Honor. Another 5th Division corpsman, pharmacist's mate 2nd Class George Wallen of Ogden, Utah, also earned the nation's highest decoration that day. By all rights, the 20-year-old shouldn't have been at the front. He'd been wounded twice by mortar fragments, each time seriously enough to be evacuated. Instead, he'd talked his way back to the lines after being treated at the division hospital. "Christ, doctor, I am not hurt that bad, and I am a damned good corpsman," he'd told a surgeon. "And besides, my outfit needs men. There is just 3 medics left in the battalion." So here he was with the 26th Regiment's 2nd Battalion in the fight for Hill 362B, and it was a very busy day. When the attack began, it quickly moved 300 yards across relatively undefended flat terrain. But then the Marines found themselves in the same mishmash of rugged gorges and jutting outcrops of rocks that bedeviled the attack of the 28th Marines, a zone where Japanese reaction was bitter and close in. Wallen was in the vortex of the struggle. Fierce hand-to-hand combat raged, and flamethrowers, bazookas, and hand grenades were the principal weapons used in this jungle of stone. Time after time, Wallen answered the urgent call for help from a fallen Marine. "Corpsmen! Corpsmen! Over here!" Wallen's dungarees were in tatters, his satchel of dressings and drugs nearly empty when he was cut down by a fusillade of small arms fire from point-blank range. He continued to crawl forward toward another wounded Marine, but it was a futile gesture. Wallen collapsed and moved no more. There was no logical explanation for Wallen's survival. Perhaps it was a will to live, an indomitable and bottomless well of determination and faith. Considering the extent of his wounds, there were no other answers. The valorous medic was still conscious when comrades managed to reach him half an hour later. "I was beginning to think you guys had missed the train," he said with a feeble smile as they placed him on a litter and headed for the rear under a heavy mortar barrage. Wallen was in a hilltop hospital on Guam when, 3 months later, he learned of his Medal of Honor. "Ain't that something?" he said to the doctor who brought the news. Less than 500 yards from where Wallen was hit, a corporal from Quincy, Massachusetts, had been pinned down with his outfit for most of 3 hours in the same fight. William Caddy was 19, a well-regarded, somewhat boisterous youth who was proud of a recent promotion to assistant squad leader and liked Marine Corps life most of the time, but was still undecided about becoming a career leatherneck. He had all the qualifications: expert rifleman, solid but wiry physique, a strong sense of discipline, ingrained qualities of leadership, and above all, a complete dedication to his comrades, a devotion that would earn him the Medal of Honor and claim his life. Shortly after 4 in the afternoon, Caddy was slouched with 2 other men in a shell hole near the base of the hill. His back was against one of the sandy sides of the crater. He was gasping for breath, shaking with a combination of fear and exhaustion, and wondering what would happen next. Small arms fire snorted overhead, and mortars and grenades exploded yards away in no man's land. One Marine had squirmed to the lip of the hole, trying to spot an especially bothersome sniper's nest, and the other sat shivering and bleary-eyed at the bottom. Only Caddy saw the Japanese hand grenade arch through the air and fall in their midst. Without a word, he lunged on top of the hissing missile and took its full blast in the chest and stomach. He smothered the explosion with his body, protecting his comrades from serious injury. His Medal of Honor citation would later be framed and hung alongside the coveted posthumous decoration in his parents' home. Corporal Charles Berry was another hero of that terrible day. TAC, a slender, blue-eyed, high-voiced 21-year-old fireteam leader from Lorain, Ohio, a bustling blue-collar industrial suburb of Cleveland. As a teenager, he'd worked at catch-as-catch-can jobs before joining the Marines. He'd looked forward to combat duty since boot camp days and was known to his buddies as one gung-ho Gyrene. Since the 8:30 morning jump-off, Berry's outfit, the 1st Battalion of the 28th Regiment, had experienced nothing but misery in the convoluted gorges north and west of the rubble of Nishi Ridge. Expected air support was scrubbed at the last minute by a sudden deluge of rain and low-hanging clouds. Tanks couldn't operate in the quagmire, and artillery spotters couldn't find targets because of poor visibility. Rifles clogged and wouldn't fire because of the muck, but dug-in Japanese were protected from the elements and methodically cut down more Marines each time they ventured from cover. By late afternoon, the advance was less than 100 yards and had claimed more than 100 casualties. Darkness came quickly, and patches of ground-hugging fog mixed with steaming sulfur mists to make the night perfect for enemy infiltration. Berry and 2 other riflemen dug a foxhole atop the edge of one of the gorges that crisscrossed the sector and settled in for their 13th night on Iwo. 2 men could try to sleep while the 3rd stood watch, but sleep was impossible in the intermittent clatter of small arms and machine gun fire and the occasional salvos from friendly and enemy artillery. When there was a lull, Berry and his comrades could hear Japanese troops moving from one position to another and see figures scooting among the rocks when an exploding star shell penetrated the overcast. Just after 2 in the morning, one of the Marines nudged Berry and whispered, "Here come the Japanese." An instant later, a fusillade of bullets ripped into the backside of the foxhole. Then came a hailstorm of grenades and one rolled over the parapet. Berry reacted without a thought of survival, covered it with his body, and died in its explosion. The Japanese didn't bother the foxhole for the rest of the night as the firefight ebbed and flowed. Just after daybreak, litter-bearers removed the wounded Marines and Berry's body from the outpost. There were few survivors among the 100-plus infiltrators who had hit the zone. 97 enemy bodies were counted the next morning. Chuck Berry's buddies didn't think this evened the score for his loss, but his posthumous Medal of Honor would help. Another of the men who had scaled Suribachi to raise the first flag, Platoon Sergeant Ernest Thomas, sacrificed his life that day. His folks in Tallahassee, Florida, knew he'd become part of a new Marine Corps legend when they heard his voice on a live NBC broadcast from the Estes a few hours after the historic event. Howlin' Mad Smith had arranged it. He wanted to personally commend the 20-year-old warrior and pass along a grateful well done to all hands. The young man soft-pedaled his own heroism, but had words of highest praise for the platoon and all of Easy Company. "They are the best outfit in the Marine Corps," he'd told the nationwide audience. Before returning to the beach, Thomas had availed himself of a slice of life he'd all but forgotten existed, a hot freshwater shower and a full meal, including 2 heaping slabs of ice cream. Once ashore, he'd trudged back to the lines, somewhat embarrassed by sudden fame. Now, 9 days later, Easy Company was battling to take an unnamed ridge north of Nishi Village, and Thomas and his platoon were pinned down. He'd just picked up a field phone to call for tank support when a bullet tore through his head. Corporal Harold Keller, the farmer from Brooklyn, Iowa, who had been on Suribachi with the sergeant, was crouched at his side. As was so often the case, there was no telling where the shot came from. Keller said, "On Iwo Jima, death came from all directions." When maps were updated that night under the glare of a hissing Coleman lantern in General Rocky's blacked-out command post tent, front lines in the 5th Division sector showed gains of from 150 to 600 yards. "Not much to brag about," the general remarked to aides in his characteristically laconic manner, but the men did one hell of a job. He paused for several seconds, closed his eyes, massaged them with right thumb and forefinger, and spoke again. "I do not know how they can do it day after day," he said. "I guess it is because they are Marines." Rocky was deeply troubled and compassionately concerned about the suffering of his troops and their mushrooming casualties. Time and again he'd lamented the tragic losses of these fine, brave young men, and wondered when it would end. He was especially distressed about the plight of Chet Graham's 26th Regiment, ESN. It had lost more than half of the 3,256 officers and men who had landed on D-Day. But the first glimmer of hope was beginning to emerge, a vague indication that the worst might be coming to an end on the 5th Division front. Despite the intensity of the day's fighting, the minor advances, and the heavy toll of fallen Marines, there had been a discernible shift in Japanese reaction. No signs that the enemy was about to quit, but torrents of artillery and mortars hadn't hammered attack troops with the previous ferocity. This didn't mean that frontal attack against Japanese positions would be any less violent for the Marines, or claim fewer casualties in still-to-come fighting. It meant only that the enemy was cutting back on his use of artillery and mortars on the 5th Division front and shifting to more desperate close-in, position by position, man-to-man combat, if that were possible in light of the savagery of what had come before. Rocky's determined attackers, it now appeared, had at last torn the seam of Kuribayashi's fanatic defences on Iwo's western front, and Erskine's hard-hit 3rd Division had breached the line in the centre of the island. But it was a different story with Gates's 4th Division. For the 6th day, it was locked in the continuing massacre of the meat grinder. At 6:30 in the morning, shortly after dawn, Walt Jordan's 24th Marines moved out again, hoping to complete the conquest of Hill 382. Walt Wensinger's 23rd Regiment once more tackled Turkey Knob with the same expectation. The attack jumped off without heavy shelling or airstrikes in an attempt to catch the enemy off guard. Some men of Walt Ridlon's Fox Company were atop Hill 382, and others were still on the slopes, sealing off bypassed caves and pillboxes with flamethrowers and demolitions. The captain and about 20 men on the crest were on an innocent-looking mound and taking small arms fire and mortars when the knoll began to rumble and shake like an earthquake. They were on the roof of a camouflaged bunker, and its cannon was now roaring as rapidly as it could be fed 75mm shells. The Japanese weren't firing at the Marines trying to take the hill, but at the cluttered beachhead 2 miles away. Startled Marines demolished the position with satchel charges and grenades tossed through its narrow aperture. At first, the push made gratifying headway, both on the summit and the sides of the hill. But then the fighting ground down to Iwo's conventional style of combat. As had been true throughout the operation, only through the slow and tedious maneuver of infantry teams employing demolitions, flamethrowers, bazookas, and hand grenades could such a stronghold be reduced. This type of fighting required able and aggressive leadership at the small unit level, and the high casualty rate among junior officers and non-commissioned officers seriously retarded this progress. Bill Crasink, the young lieutenant who had taken over the remnants of Easy Company, was a case in point. He was wounded and evacuated under heavy fire shortly before 9 in the morning. There were countless other examples of the losses cutting down frontline officers. Dick Reich, the 23-year-old Johnny-on-the-spot shavetail lieutenant, took over the company until Captain Charles Ireland arrived. Ireland was shot in the left leg 90 minutes later and was carried to the rear. Reich took over again until Captain Robert O'Melia, a regimental bandmaster, came forward. He was dead by a mortar blast within minutes. Now there was no reason for Reich to take command another time. Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment, 4th Marine Division no longer existed. The meat grinder had chewed it to pieces, and its 12 surviving, exhausted, bewildered, stupefied, dirty, bleary-eyed men were merged into Fox Company. Turkey Knob, the amphitheatre, and Minami Village continued to take their toll of the 25th Regiment in fighting that was relentless. A 4-room blockhouse with thick walls and roof of reinforced concrete still sprouted defiance after almost a week of close-in combat. Mines were strewn in every approach to the structure and made tank operation almost impossible until the way was cleared by demolition teams. The inverted bowl of the amphitheatre held a network of blockhouses, pillboxes, and caves that had to be demolished one at a time. The levelled cluster of huts of Minami still contained deadly sniper nests and mortar pits. By noon, the attack had become another slugging match. Throughout the afternoon, demolition men and bazooka teams worked over caves and bypassed bunkers and pillboxes. Sherman tanks braved narrow, twisting, mine-infested paths to support the push. An almost constant stream of artillery blasted enemy positions barely 100 yards in front of Marine lines. But riflemen again were the hammerhead, and gains came at heavy cost. When the Marines took up final positions for the night, the deepest penetration in the amphitheatre was some 300 yards. Minami remained defiant, and the blockhouse atop Turkey Knob still was held by the Japanese. But Walt Ridland's men on Hill 382 had pushed across the no-man's land on the summit and moved down its eastern slopes. "We will close the meat grinder for good tomorrow," General Cates told aides that night as he took a final look at the sector map. Then he shaved with an heirloom straight razor and quickly went to sleep in his sandbagged revetment command post, oblivious of occasional enemy artillery and mortars falling nearby. Dawn came slowly to Iwo on March 4th, day 13 after D-Day. Clouds hung low over the island and a chilly rain was falling. Poor visibility cancelled airstrikes from the carriers and artillery spotting missions by the Maytag Messerschmitts. For the same reason, there was very little naval gunfire for fear of it landing on Marine lines. But the morning's attack was mounted nonetheless. It began at 7:30. 3 hours earlier, 73 Army B-29 superfortresses, taking off at 30-second intervals, had roared down the 3-mile-long coral-surfaced runways on Saipan and Guam. In close formations at 35,000 feet, the bombers flew directly over Iwo Jima for another high-altitude raid on the Tokyo area, now almost a daily occurrence. Crew members could make out the island through breaks in the sodden clouds and see the flash and smoke from occasional artillery shells exploding behind enemy lines. Raymond Fred Marlowe, a first lieutenant from Danville, Illinois, was at the controls of the lead bomber in an early wave. This was the third mission over the Japanese homeland for the 24-year-old aircraft commander and the 10-man crew of Dynamite. They'd flown to Saipan from the States 5 weeks earlier, after completing combat training to become part of the Army Air Corps' ever-increasing attacks against Japan's heartland. Just after 11:30, the B-29s began their bomb runs. It was more than 30 degrees below zero at the 6-mile altitude. Heavy anti-aircraft fire laced the formations, but only a few Japanese interceptors could reach the attackers. So far, the superfortresses were having an easy time of it. "Bombs away!" Second Lieutenant Lee Escom of Warren, Ohio, shouted over the plane's intercom as its 10 tons of explosives fell earthward, tumbling end over end toward the target area, an aircraft plant southwest of Tokyo. "I think we hit the enemy good," he added as an afterthought. "That takes care of that," Marlowe said to Second Lieutenant Edwin Mockler, his co-pilot from Park Falls, Wisconsin. "Now, let us get out of here and head for home." A near miss from anti-aircraft fire rocked the bomber as Marlowe put it into a steep turn and headed south toward the Marianas. Then, from Bombardier Eschmann, "The goddamned bomb bay doors won't close." He slammed the control lever again. Still no movement. Squirming to the rear of his cramped quarters in the plexiglass nose of the plane, Eschmann peered through a heavily frosted porthole into the cavernous bomb bay. "I cannot see any damage from Akak," he reported. "I think the doors are frozen open." Now Marlowe's voice crackled over the intercom. "No sweat," he assured the crew. "As long as we can hold this altitude, we won't have to worry about Japanese fighters, and the anti-aircraft fire already is behind us." His eyes scanned the fuel gauges. "It will be a long, slow trip back to Saipan, and we have got enough gas to make it." But Marlowe knew, despite his confident words, something the crew suspected. Luck would have to fly with dynamite for nearly 1,400 miles if they were to survive. Marlowe immediately throttled back to conserve fuel. This and strong headwinds cut the bomber's speed to under 200 miles an hour, and it was soon a lonely speck in the sky, far behind faster formations on a course that would take it just east of Iwo. 3 hours from Japan, and 20 minutes north of the island, a red light flashed above the gauges to the main wing gasoline tanks. Marlowe said nothing to the crew. Still no sweat, he told himself, but it was time to switch to the 1,000-gallon reserve tank. When he flipped the transfer valve, nothing happened. Co-pilot Mockler watched what went on and saw the anxious look on the plane commander's face. "Now it is time to sweat," Marlowe said. Dynamite had fuel to stay aloft less than half an hour. Marlowe had 2 options. He could ditch at sea and hope he and his crew would be picked up by a Catalina flying boat, or maybe a destroyer or submarine on picket duty, or he could try a landing on Iwo Jima. Neither was inviting. As B-29 crewmen were prone to put it, once you ditch, you have 2 chances to survive. Slim and none at all. And Slim just left town. Marlowe knew the battle still raged on Iwo, and that no disabled superfortress had yet landed on the island. "Let us give Iwo a call anyway," he told the radio man, Sergeant James Cox. "Maybe if we are lucky we can get in there." Cox switched on his transmitter and called Gatepost, the code word for air-sea rescue operations. Aboard the Auburn, radioman Second Class William Welsh heard the signal. It had so far been an uneventful Sunday for him. Rain and heavy mist had cancelled all carrier missions, the purpose for monitoring the emergency channel, and he'd just finished the crossword puzzle in the ship's mimeographed daily newspaper. Now Welsh was about to set in motion a chain reaction that would continue until the war's end. The real purpose of Iwo's vicious battle, what the invasion and fighting were all about to unfold for the first time, the saving of American lives instead of taking them. "This is Gatepost," Welsh responded. "Who are you? What is your problem? Can we help?" Cox's answer: "We are a B-29 low on fuel. Can you give us a bearing for Iwo, and can we land there?" "Roger," Welsh answered. "We will get a fix on your position and see if the airstrip can take you." The Auburn's radar and direction finder pinpointed the superfortress in less than a minute. Major Batelling, the duty communications officer, alerted all hands aboard ship, and the radio room was jammed almost immediately. A Catalina flying boat took off from near the eastern base of Suribachi into the overcast but clearing skies to be ready to rescue survivors if the bomber ditched. Auburn's transmitter crackled with Welsh's calm words. "You are 30 miles north of Iwo Jima. You should be able to see Kita Jima." "We have it in sight, Gatepost. We see it." "Roger. Your course for Iwo is 167 degrees. Do you want to ditch offshore or try a landing?" Marlowe cut in. "We would prefer to land, thank you." "Roger. We will clear bulldozers off the strip for you, but watch out for enemy anti-aircraft and mortar fire." 10 minutes later, on the Auburn's crowded bridge, anxious eyes spotted the slow-flying B-29 through binoculars approaching Iwo from the northwest below the scudding overcast at 700 feet. Dynamite buzzed the island in 2 low-level passes while Marlowe scanned cockpit instruments and studied his final approach. There was no let-up in the battlefront action. But Marines and Seabees on the fringe of the airstrip followed the plane's sweeping circle as it swung around, banked steeply west of Suribachi's summit, and lined up on the north-south runway of Motoyama No. 1. Less than 100 feet from the ground, Marlowe lowered flaps and landing gear. Then the B-29 slammed hard onto the packed volcanic earth, bounced twice, and stayed on the runway as Marlowe jammed the brakes and reversed thrust of the 4-bladed propellers to slow the skidding plane. A cloud of dust billowed behind Dynamite, careening along the airstrip and screeching to a stop at the northern tip, but not before its left wing crumpled a telephone pole. As Marlowe swung the plane into a fast turn and taxied towards Suribachi at near takeoff speed, Japanese gunners from beyond Motoyama No. 2 hit the runway with a barrage of ineffective mortar fire. Hundreds of Marines and Seabees watched the plane come to a halt with propellers still turning. They swarmed around the 60-ton giant, cheering and waving as the crew tumbled from escape hatches. One hatch opened and 4 or 5 men jumped and fell to their hands and knees. Private First Class Frank Crowe of Cambridge, Massachusetts, recalled. What a contrast. Here were men so glad to be on the island that they were kissing it. A mile or 2 to the north were 3 Marine divisions who thought the place was hell on earth, its ground not even good enough to spit on. And that's the incredible story of how the battle for Iwo Jima became about saving lives as much as taking them, how a crippled bomber and its desperate crew became the first of thousands who would find salvation on this hellish piece of volcanic rock. The airfield that Marines were dying to capture had just proved its worth, even while the battle still raged around it. This was what it was all about, turning Iwo Jima from a Japanese fortress into an American lifeline, one bloody yard at a time. But even as this moment of triumph unfolded, the battle ground on with undiminished fury. The Marines watching that B-29 land still had to face the grim reality that the fight for Iwo was far from over. The bloodletting would continue, position by position, cave by cave, man by man. The struggle for the meat grinder intensified as Marines tried once more to silence those killing fields. The 4-room blockhouse that had defied a week of close combat still stood like a monument to Japanese determination. Every approach remained littered with mines, making tank operations nearly impossible until demolition teams could clear the way. The amphitheater's inverted bowl harbored a deadly network of blockhouses, pillboxes, and caves that had to be demolished one at a time, each claiming its toll in Marine blood. Day after day, the pattern repeated itself with heartbreaking consistency. Demolition men and bazooka teams worked over caves and bypassed bunkers. Sherman tanks braved narrow, twisting, mine-infested paths to support the push. Artillery pounded enemy positions barely 100 yards in front of Marine lines with an almost constant stream of shells. But in the end, it always came down to the riflemen. They were the hammerhead, and every gain came at a heavy cost. The statistics told only part of the story. When commanders tallied the casualties each night, the numbers were staggering, but they couldn't capture the individual acts of heroism, the split-second decisions that meant life or death, the bonds between men that transcended fear and pain. Each fallen Marine had a story, a hometown, people waiting for them back home. Each yard of volcanic ash was purchased with young American lives. General Cates had been confident they would close the meat grinder for good tomorrow, but tomorrow kept bringing more of the same grinding attrition. The Japanese defenders, knowing they were doomed, sold their lives as dearly as possible. They had nowhere to retreat, no hope of rescue or reinforcement. General Kuribayashi's orders were simple and final: fight to the death, make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against the Marines. Iwo's volcanic soil made digging foxholes a nightmare. The loose ash provided poor footing, clogged weapons, and got into everything: food, water, equipment. The sulfur fumes that seeped from cracks in the earth burned eyes and throats. At night, the ground was warm to the touch in places, a reminder that they were fighting on a volcanic island that could have been designed by the devil himself for defense. The Japanese tunnel system continued to confound the attackers. Marines would clear a position, move forward, only to have Japanese troops emerge from hidden tunnel entrances behind them. It was like fighting ghosts, an enemy that could appear and disappear at will, striking from unexpected directions before melting back into their underground warren. The psychological toll was immense. Marines who had landed on D-Day were hollow-eyed shadows of their former selves. They'd seen too much death, experienced too much terror, pushed themselves beyond what they thought possible. Yet they kept going, driven by duty, brotherhood, and the simple determination not to let their buddies down. Some found dark humor in their situation. "At least we're making the maps simpler," one sergeant joked as another Japanese position was marked as captured. "Pretty soon we'll run out of island and they'll have to send us somewhere else to get shot at." But there was nothing funny about the reality they faced each dawn. The Japanese had turned every ridge, every ravine, every pile of rocks into a fortress. Their artillery might be running low, their numbers dwindling, but their determination remained unshaken. They would fight until the last man, and everyone knew it. The Navy continued its bombardment, the big guns of the battleships and cruisers adding their weight to the battle, but naval gunfire had its limitations. The Japanese were too well dug in, their positions too cleverly concealed. It often took direct hits to knock out a position, and even then, the Japanese might have alternative positions ready. Air support faced similar challenges. Carrier planes swooped in with bombs and napalm, but the closeness of the opposing forces often made airstrikes too dangerous for the Marines. Pilots had to be extremely careful not to hit friendly forces, and the Japanese had learned to hug Marine lines closely to minimize the effectiveness of air support. The corpsmen, MSEL, the Navy medics attached to Marine units, continued their heroic work under impossible conditions. They ran into fire to reach wounded Marines, often becoming casualties themselves. The cry of corpsmen was heard too often across the battlefield, and these brave men answered every call, knowing it might be their last. The wounded who made it to the beach faced another ordeal, the evacuation to hospital ships offshore. The beach was still under intermittent enemy fire, and loading wounded onto landing craft was dangerous work. But the Navy beach parties and Marine shore parties never stopped, maintaining the vital lifeline between the fighting forces and the fleet offshore. Supplies continued to flow ashore despite the dangers. Ammunition, water, food, medical supplies, POSA, all had to be brought in under fire and distributed to units at the front. The logistics of keeping 3 Marine divisions supplied and fighting was a monumental task, made infinitely harder by enemy fire and the difficult terrain. The Seabees worked miracles keeping the airfields operational. Even as Japanese mortars and artillery tried to crater the runways, these construction battalions filled holes, cleared debris, and kept the strips ready for emergency landings like the one Dynamite had just made. Their work would save thousands of lives before the war ended. Communications remained a constant challenge. Radio equipment failed in the harsh conditions. Telephone lines laid by wiremen were cut by enemy fire and had to be constantly repaired. Runners carried messages when all else failed, sprinting through fire-swept areas with vital information. The battle was taking its toll on leadership at all levels. Company commanders, platoon leaders, squad leaders, the small unit leaders who made the attack possible, OPPs, were being killed and wounded at an alarming rate. Sergeants found themselves commanding companies, corporals leading platoons, privates taking over squads. The Marine Corps' emphasis on training every man to step up and lead was being validated in the bloodiest way possible. Some units ceased to exist as fighting formations. Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment, 4th Marine Division had been reduced to 12 men and absorbed into Fox Company. Other units faced similar fates. Replacements were fed into the meat grinder, but they couldn't replace the experience and unit cohesion lost with the veterans. The Japanese, too, were suffering. Their casualties were nearly 100% in positions that were overrun. They had no medical evacuation system, no way to treat their wounded effectively. Their dead often couldn't be retrieved, left to decompose in sealed caves or destroyed positions, but still they fought with a fatalism and determination that amazed even their enemies. General Suribachi, now in his new headquarters near Kitano Point, continued to direct the defense with skill. He knew he couldn't win, knew that every one of his men would die on this island. But he was determined to make the American victory so costly that they would think twice about invading the Japanese home islands. The Marines, for their part, had developed a grudging respect for their enemy. These weren't the pushover Japanese they'd been told about in training. These were skilled, determined fighters who used every advantage the terrain offered. They didn't surrender, didn't run, and fought with a skill that demanded respect. Night brought no real rest. The Japanese conducted infiltration raids, trying to disrupt Marine positions and cause chaos. Marines stood watch in foxholes, straining to see movement in the darkness, jumping at every sound. Star shells burst overhead periodically, casting an eerie, flickering light over the battlefield and creating dancing shadows that played tricks on exhausted eyes. The morning of March 5th arrived with the same grim routine. Stand to before dawn, when everyone was alert for the possible dawn attack. Then breakfast, if you could call cold sea rations breakfast, and preparation for another day of combat. Weapons were cleaned and checked, ammunition distributed, final coordinates confirmed. The attack began again, always the attack. There was no other way. The Japanese wouldn't surrender, wouldn't negotiate. They had to be dug out of their positions one by one, killed or sealed in their caves. It was brutal, primitive warfare despite all the modern weapons. In the end, it came down to young men with rifles, grenades and flamethrowers, advancing into the face of death. The terrain in the northern part of the island was if anything worse than what they'd faced before. Ridges, gorges and boulder fields created a maze of interlocking defensive positions. Every piece of ground had been registered by Japanese mortars and artillery. They knew exactly where to place their fire for maximum effect. Marine ingenuity continued to find ways to crack Japanese defenses. Tanks and armored bulldozers worked together to create paths through the boulder fields. Engineers used massive charges to seal cave entrances. Flamethrower tanks, Zippos as the Marines called them, proved particularly effective at clearing out stubborn positions. But every solution the Marines found, the Japanese seemed to have a counter. They placed anti-tank mines in unexpected locations. They dug their positions deeper. They created false positions to draw fire, while the real defensive positions remained hidden. It was a deadly game of move and countermove. The 5th Division continued its push on the western side of the island, metre by bloody metre. The 3rd Division ground forward in the centre, paying for every advance with Marine blood. The 4th Division kept hammering at the meat grinder, that collection of defensive positions that had already claimed so many lives. Each division had developed its own character through the battle. The 5th, which had taken Suribachi, fought with the confidence of that early victory, but also the exhaustion of constant combat. The 3rd, which had come in as reserve, brought fresh energy but learned quickly that Iwo showed no mercy to newcomers. The 4th, bloodied in the meat grinder, fought with a grim determination born of seeing too many friends fall. The wounded continued to stream back from the front. Many would return to duty after treatment, their wounds patched up just enough to let them fight again. Others, more seriously hurt, faced evacuation and a long recovery. The most serious cases were flown out on transport planes once the airfields were secure enough for regular flights. Those who died were buried in the growing cemetery near the beaches. Neat rows of crosses and stars of David marked the graves of Marines who had given everything for this desolate piece of volcanic rock. Chaplains conducted services when they could, but often the dead were buried quickly and without ceremony. There would be time for proper mourning after the battle. The Japanese bodies created a different problem. In the heat, decomposition was rapid, and the smell of death hung over the battlefield. When possible, Japanese dead were buried in mass graves or sealed in the caves where they fell. But often they lay where they died, a grim reminder of the battle's cost. Water remained a critical issue. The island had no natural water supply, so everything had to be brought in from the ships. Marines learned to hoard their water, taking small sips to make it last. The volcanic ash seemed to suck moisture from everything, leaving mouths dry and throats parched. Food was monotonous but adequate. C rations and K rations provided calories, if not satisfaction. Hot food was a rare luxury at the front, usually only available when units were pulled back for rest. Marines joked about the menu, beans and motherhood. They called one particularly despised combination, but ate whatever they had. Ammunition supply was constant and critical. The volume of fire required to crack Japanese positions was enormous. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, ammunition, all consumed ammunition at prodigious rates. The supply chain from ship to shore to front had to function perfectly, or attacks would stall for lack of firepower. Medical supplies were equally critical. Bandages, morphine, sulfur, plasma, all were consumed at alarming rates. The corpsmen and doctors worked miracles with what they had, but the stream of casualties never stopped. The hospital ships offshore were filled to capacity, and more wounded arrived with every tide. The Japanese, cut off from resupply, faced increasing shortages of everything. Their ammunition was running low, forcing them to be more selective in their fire. Water was scarce in many positions. Food was down to emergency rations. Medical supplies were almost non-existent, but still they fought on. General Kuribayashi's messages to Tokyo became increasingly final. He reported the situation honestly. The Americans were slowly but inevitably crushing his defenses. He requested that his men be honored for their sacrifice. He prepared for his own death with the calm of a samurai following Bushido, the warrior's code. The American commanders, meanwhile, dealt with pressure from above to finish the battle quickly. The invasion was taking longer and costing more than predicted. Every day meant more casualties, more resources consumed, more wear on men and equipment. But there was no quick solution. The Japanese had to be defeated position by position. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima was being proven daily now. More B-29s made emergency landings, their crews saved by the captured airfields. Fighter escorts could now accompany bombers all the way to Japan. The submarine rescue service had a base for flying boats. The island that had cost so much blood was starting to pay dividends in saved American lives. But for the Marines still fighting, strategic considerations meant little. Their world had shrunk to the next ridge, the next cave, the next bundle of enemy positions that had to be taken. They fought not for grand strategy, but for the man next to them, for their unit's honor, and for the simple goal of surviving another day. The battle had developed its own rhythm now: attack during the day, dig in at night, take casualties, call for replacements, gain 100 yards, sometimes 200 on a good day. Mark the new positions on the map, prepare to do it all again tomorrow. It was a grinding, relentless process that wore down both body and spirit. Yet morale, surprisingly, remained stable. The Marines knew they were winning, slowly but surely. Every day the Japanese held territory grew smaller. Every day brought them closer to the end. They could see it now, not immediately, but soon. The island would be theirs. The only question was the cost. Letters home, when there was time to write them, spoke of everything except the reality of combat. Marines wrote about the weather, about friends, about plans for after the war. They couldn't describe what they were experiencing, partly because censors would remove it, but mostly because there were no words adequate to convey the horror and heroism of Iwo Jima. The Japanese defenders, isolated in their positions, had no such outlet. They could only wait for the inevitable final American assault on each position. Some wrote final letters that would never be sent, prayers and poems that would be found with their bodies. They faced death with a resignation that was both admirable and terrible. The battle for Iwo Jima had become a test of wills as much as a military operation. Which side could endure more? Which would break first? The answer was becoming clear. Minus not break, the Marines would not break. They would pay the price, however high, to take this island. And the Japanese would exact that price to the last man. As March wore on, the end came into sight, distant but definite. The Japanese pocket was shrinking. Their fire was slackening, not from choice but from lack of ammunition. Their numbers were dwindling with no hope of replacement, but they would not surrender. Everyone knew the battle would end only when the last Japanese defender was dead. The cost was staggering. Thousands of Marines had already fallen, and thousands more would fall before it was over. But they had proved something important, that American fighting men could match the Japanese in courage, determination, and sacrifice. Iwo Jima would go down in history not as a victory, but as an epic of endurance and valor. The raising of the flag on Suribachi already seemed like ancient history to the Marines, still fighting in the north. That moment of triumph had been just the beginning. The real battle, the grinding, bitter fight for every yard of this hellish island, continued without glamour or glory, just young men doing an impossible job because it had to be done. And so the battle ground on, cave by cave, ridge by ridge, life by life, toward its inevitable conclusion. Iwo Jima would be taken. The only question that remained was how many more would die before the last shot was fired. In this grinding arithmetic of war, every life saved by the captured airfields had to be weighed against every life lost taking them. It was a calculation that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives.